Well, good morning, everyone, and happy Monday morning to you. Hope you had an absolutely fantastic weekend. We're, here it is March, what should be winter, and over the weekend here in southern Oklahoma, we had 80-degree weather. We had 3 straight days, just absolutely unbelievable weather. Now, one day it turned 50 down actually in the lower 40s, and it was like, whoa, wait a minute, we're not ready for this. uh, but otherwise, the weekend, like I said the other day, if you ordered weather out of a Sears catalog, then that's the kind of days that you would have ordered. For all of you younger people out there, you don't know what a Sears catalog is, okay? For those of you who are a little more mature, you know what a Sears catalog is, or was, I should say. Doesn't exist anymore. So anyway, thank you again for joining us, for joining me. My name is Don K. Preston. I'm the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. And let me say this. Here it is March. I have not even informed Alan Morton what our special will be this month. However, it will include my book on Resurrection Feast Fulfilled. What I think it will include is the book on These Are the Days in Which All Things Will Be Fulfilled, which was an offer I made a couple of months ago, and it was very, very well received. So I may repeat that. All right, I'll let you know about that later this week. All right, so we are continuing our discussion of the feasts of Israel. Let us not forget, Leviticus chapter 23 lists all of the feast days as feasts of the Lord. That means that every feast that he mentions was a ceremonial feast day. Now, why is that important? Well, because we are told over here in Colossians. Now, I'm going to be doing a more extensive exegesis of Colossians chapter 2 later. I've already hinted, I've already suggested, I've already shared with you some thoughts that refute the normal claims about what that verse is representing and teaching. But I want to represent that now, again, to kind of feed it along, so to speak. So what we are told is, well, the Sabbath day is not a ceremonial feast day. But Paul taught, he doesn't say it, but Paul taught in Colossians 2:16 and 17 that the, quote, ceremonial feast days had been done away with. Well, let me say again, as I taught last week, that is absolutely false. It is not what Colossians chapter 2 teaches. But let me make one further observation here that I'll undoubtedly make again as we go along. It has been argued in the discussion on my YouTube channel. It has been suggested that, well, God took the laws, the feast days that were against us, that were the handwriting of ordinances that were against us. He took those feast days out of the way. Well, first of all, no one has documented from Scripture, has not even tried to show where either Moses and the Jews, from the inception of the feast days, or to Jesus' time, ever considered a single one of the feast days as, quote, against us. Now, we could argue from a purely personal perspective, well, it had to be inconvenient to travel from Rome to Jerusalem to observe the three major feast days. Wow, look at the cost, look at the time, look at the danger. Is that what Paul meant when he said they were against us? Well, here is a reality, ladies and gentlemen. The reality is that the Jews historically, when they described the feast days, and in Scripture, Scripture refers to the joy of the feasts. Okay? I will take away the joy of your feast. Now, if God described the feast as substantive realities of joy, then I think it's a little bit disingenuous to argue that the feast days, other than the Sabbath, were somehow contrary to us and against us, speaking of the Jews. Furthermore, when you look closely at how the feast days were described by the Jews, you find that the Jews referred to, for instance, Sukkot as the feast of our joy. I don't think it's appropriate, therefore, to speak of any of the feast days as a handwriting of ordinances that was against us and that was contrary to us. Now, listen, the same thing could be said of the Sabbath. It was the seventh day Sabbath. It was a day of rest. Well, I mean, after all, that cut into productivity. That cut into money making. So a lot of people, according to Amos chapter 8, looked upon that as a burden. When will the new moon be gone? When will the Sabbath be over? So that we may falsify the balances by deceit, and et cetera, et cetera. So here are these greedy, avaricious, dishonest individuals who looked upon the Sabbath as an inconvenience because they couldn't do work on that day. Do you think Paul's writing about the Sabbath in that way in Colossians 2? Pretty obviously not. The point here is, ladies and gentlemen, when you make the claim that Paul said that the new moon's feast days and Sabbaths were shadows of good things to come, then how could he refer to them as against us and contrary to us? Because they were types and they were shadows. By the way, in Leviticus chapter 23, the word convocation is given to describe and to define each one of the feast days, each one of them. Do you realize that the word convocation means rehearsal? That's why there were types and shadows of the things that were coming. Okay, so if the observance of those feast days were actually types and shadows, rehearsals of the coming good things, then how could those festal observances be, quote, against us and contrary to us? Weren't they a constant reminder of the good things that were coming? And let's remember, Paul's not speaking just of the seventh day Sabbath in Colossians chapter 2. He uses the Greek word Sabbaton, which is used in the Old Testament, Leviticus chapter 23. These are the Sabbaths, Sabbaton, of the Lord. And he's speaking of each one of them, every one of the feast days. And so it's really illogical, ladies and gentlemen, to argue that, well, Paul is describing the, quote, ceremonial feast days as something that was against us, but not the seventh day. Pardon me, because let's keep in mind, the seventh day was every bit as much of a cessation from work, from making money, as were the other feast days. There is no distinction whatsoever in the form, the nature, the structure of all of the Sabbaths in regard to a cessation of labor. And so when efforts are made to go to Colossians chapter 2 and saying, well, it was the ceremonial feast days that were handwriting of ordinances that were against us, that were contrary to us. What I'm doing is I'm challenging anyone And everyone who wants to make that argument that Paul's talking about the quote ceremonial feast days, but not the seventh, point number one, I want some scripture. You know, an awful lot of the folks trying to substantiate the seventh day observance on Christians today. And by and large, these discussions have been very friendly. I appreciate that. Just keep it up. By the way, let me make a reminder here. A little bit of a caveat here. Not a caveat, but a digression. Look, folks, keep your comments on the subject of the videos. Some of you, those who are arguing for the continuance of the Sabbath, several of you are violating that rule. But that's the rule of my forum. Don't sidetrack the discussion of the subject of the video. Doesn't matter what the video is, then don't come on my forum and try to sidetrack it into a discussion of the Sabbath or anything else for that matter. All right? Doesn't matter. Please observe and honor my rules. Some are more egregiously guilty of this than others. Okay? And one more point, a little bit more of a digression. When you're going to discuss these issues with the other posters on my forum, now this goes for both sides, all right? Don't start calling one another names. Do not start calling someone that disagrees with you a heretic and doomed. Don't do it. Disagree respectfully. Disagree honorably. Present your case. Do not impugn the standing of others and their relationship with God. If you do that repeatedly, then I'll take action. I'm not going to have that kind of ungodly kind of actions on my forum. So once again, respectful, collegial, friendly, all right? You know, you can press a point without being ugly. So obey the rules. Back to the issue, all right? I had to do that because I've been noticing the heat rising a little bit. Now, again, it's on the part of both sides, so I'm not picking on one side. Just keep in mind, keep it clean, keep it friendly, keep it respectful. All right. Now, I want to read to you. Well, I don't have time to do this, so I'm going to pick this up on the morning. I'll cut this video just slightly short. So let me remind you once again, all right? Nowhere, and this is the challenge once again, for anyone and everyone seeking to delineate between the so-called ceremonial Sabbath days, and keep in mind, guess what? The seventh-day Sabbath is called a feast of the Lord, therefore it was a ceremonial feast day. And Paul makes no distinction between certain kinds of Sabbaths and other kinds of Sabbaths in Colossians, or anywhere else for that matter. So, if you're going to argue that there is a distinction between the seventh-day Sabbath and argue it was not a ceremonial feast day versus the other feast days, then bring forth your strong reasons, provide book, chapter, and verse. It's not enough, ladies and gentlemen, to get on there and say, well, the Sabbath was this and it was that, and the other Sabbaths, plural, were this and they were that. And see, there's a clear distinction between them. God gave all of the Sabbaths, plural. God gave one covenant at Sinai. One covenant. That singular covenant included the Decalogue, but that singular covenant included all of the other ordinances. So, point number one, if you're going to delineate between a non-ceremonial Sabbath, i.e. the seventh day, versus the Sabbaths of Colossians 2, then produce the book, chapter, and verse. Secondly, if you're going to argue that the ceremonial feast days, as opposed supposedly, versus the seventh day Sabbath, if you're going to argue that those other feast days were this handwriting of ordinances that was against us and contrary to us, then produce the book, chapter, and verse in which Israel or Yahweh ever said those other feast days were against Israel and contrary to Israel. Now that's your challenge, all right? If you got the verses, then bring them forth. If you got the argumentation, then bring forth your strong reasons. So today is a challenge, all right? Prove to us that the other feast days, apart from the seventh day, were contrary to Israel. Prove to us that God made a distinction between the seventh day and the other Sabbaths and delineated from them. Or show to us that there were actually two covenants at Sinai, the Decalogue versus the rest. And show to us where God gave the Decalogue, but God did not give the rest of it. So there are 2 or 3 or 4 challenges for you, right? Okay, I'm out of time. Thanks so much for joining me. I'll see you tomorrow on the flip side.